All right, warm welcome from my side. Thanks a lot for this very nice introduction. And good to see that there are actually some people in the audience who know about Alaf. That is very assuring for me. So we talked about the B word, and you see the B word in the title, and there's a lot of fuss about the B word. I'm talking about blockchains. And you also see when you look at the title that I actually gave this talk, then I want to ask how to execute business processes on the blockchain. So it means my starting point for looking into the blockchain technology is not to go bottom up and saying, well, there's a technology that can do some things, but I look at it from a perspective of the processes as a starting point and how I can actually go from the processes towards the execution on the blockchain. So for doing this, I want to discuss with you very briefly as an entry how such processes are typically defined. And we see here a diagram that is shown in the BPMN notation. I might ask, who does know BPMN? Please show me your hand. Quite a few people. For those who do not know BPMN, maybe you have seen similar diagrams as flowcharts, as UML activity diagrams, etc. So what these diagrams tell is how a process is specified. And we see here a scenario that is an inter-organizational process where different parties are involved in a logistics scenario. So that scenario starts where a bulk buyer, here at the bottom, is placing an order with a manufacturer, and that manufacturer then has to calculate the demand in order to fulfill that particular order. So it means that a manufacturer may actually discover, well, we do not have enough materials in place, and we need to order with our suppliers materials to actually serve that order. That means the manufacturer may get involved a middleman, and that middleman is then actually involving another supplier that may produce certain spare parts, and this is then eventually via a special carrier transported to the manufacturer, and the manufacturer starts producing, and then eventually this order is fulfilled. So what I see is like very often when we talk about blockchains and we run into discussions with people who have heard about the topic, that there are some questions around this. Therefore, also I may ask you at this stage, so who would actually call themselves a person who has worked with blockchain on a technical level and has a good understanding of this? All right. Who has heard about it and has some rough idea what a blockchain is? Who has never heard of blockchains? All right. Good. So, and in particular, when we are technical people who know like software, information technology, and being developers, actually people in our surroundings may ask us, well, you are the IT guy, so what is this blockchain thingy? And I'm trying to use this talk to guide you a little bit of how you can actually answer such a question from a friend or a family member. So, and if you try to actually put this very sharply, it may be that actually we may ask ourselves, well, can we actually put that process on the blockchain? Who thinks yes? Who's not so certain? Who thinks no? All right, so apparently some people are uncertain about this. But actually, this question is actually easy to answer with a yes, because when we look at different blockchain systems, like for instance Ethereum, they come with a programming language that is Turing complete, and therefore the answer is yes. But maybe this is not very satisfying for your friends or your project partners to hear a simple yes. And therefore I want to clarify a little bit more why the answer is yes and how we can use this. And what maybe then actually be the next better question than a simple yes and no question. All right, since in the end blockchains are out there, the technology is being used. Some of you may have seen yesterday's news that the R3 consortium with their Core system has started operating, and that some of the banks have already started transacting via a blockchain technology in order to facilitate certain inter-organizational processes in order to make them more efficient. So therefore, it's out there, it's relevant, and the question is actually where is this technology most relevant and maybe where it makes less sense. Okay, so I'll try to approach this question then with essentially some sub-questions. I want to actually elaborate a little bit more upon why is the answer yes, we can, to this question if we can put a process onto the blockchain. And then to make that more transparent, I want to explain a bit about some collaborative research with our colleagues in Australia, where we have developed translations from such BPMN models as we have seen them on the previous slide towards blockchain artifacts. And then I want to discuss with you a little bit the question, what may be actually a better question than can we do this? Yeah? All right, so I will approach this, let's say, very high level. I will not go into technical details, and I will try to actually present this in a way how you may potentially explain this to one of your friends, I hope. So, first one, we have to make some observations about the blockchain technology, which are important in particular when discussing about how processes may be supported by this. So the first observation is that the blockchain is actually a file of transactions. So there is one file where all these transactions are recorded, and this is already something that is important for us because when we have this record as such a file, we know about the history of certain evolvements, and this is particularly important for business processes. So that's the first observation. Well, it's not just this single file, but the second thing is that this file that is the record of all these transactions, it is not in the ownership of a single company or a single person or a single computer, but it is a file that is distributed and available as copies on a network. And this is important because in this way, there's not a single person or a single party that can take control over that file. So therefore, it's distributed. That's the second observation. And well, recognizing that it is a file, it's of course an important question to realize how is this file actually extended? How do we make it larger? How do we record new transactions? And the simple answer to this is done in a controlled way, according to the blockchain protocols, and it involves encryption technologies, such that once we have something recorded, that we cannot change it anymore in the future. And in this way, we have an ordered list of things and transactions that happened, and this is important from a process perspective. So there is this file that has all these different transactions recorded. So when we look into what are actually business processes, the simple answer is, well, for specifying a business process, we need to understand two things. The first thing is we need to understand what is the state of that particular business process. And the second thing is how do we move from one state towards the other state. So that's the transitional perspective. So and you see like in our scenario that we have seen regarding this logistic interaction, a state may be that the manufacturer is actually recognizing that it has received this order and sending a confirmation to that respective bulk buyer. So simply observing the order has been received is a mentioning of a particular state. The second thing is what we have not yet discussed so far. That is the question, how do I actually transition from one state to the next state? So in business processes and diagrams like BPMN, we can show that with these so-called gateway symbols, certain decisions are being taken based on certain data input. But if you think that, try to reformulate that very simply, it is actually that there's a certain if-then-else statement saying that when a certain state is reached, then we know what is the next thing that should happen. Could be something like if the materials are available or they can be produced, then that should have the consequence that the order gets confirmed. So this is the rule how we can actually move to the next state of the process. So blockchain not only helps us to record the states of this process, but it also provides support for the second aspect, that is the transitional perspective. And for this transitional perspective, there are specific types of programs, and these programs are called smart contracts. Such a smart contract is, let's say, in the most simple way, a description of such a rule that if something has happened or something is observed as a state, then something else shall happen. And that is exactly a mechanism that we can use for describing this transitional side of processes as well. And there's some interesting characteristics of these smart contracts. They are also stored on the blockchain. That means also we can make sure that they are not altered and that we can rely on that they support us in executing the process. So that means in this way you have like these two components, and now comes the most technical slide that you will see in my presentation, just to give you a little bit of a feeling of, well, let's say where the magic happens. This is just a simple snippet of Solidity code, just to give you a feeling that it looks pretty much like other programming languages. It uses a particular syntax, and this contract object here has specific methods that can be used to initiate it and to implement certain logic. So putting these two mechanisms together, we have the state that is recorded on the blockchain. This is what we can use for representing states of processes. Second thing, we can implement this transitional logic with smart contracts. And in this way, we can fully support the execution of a process on the blockchain. So therefore, the answer is yes, we can. So let's try to be a little bit more specific now, how we actually may design a particular process and then actually get this onto the blockchain. This is the second question I try to approach. How do we translate such a BPMN model into respective blockchain artifacts? So the simple idea is that we try to identify the different pieces of logic that are described here in this process specification. And these can be mapped to certain components, patterns, and templates, which then are composed together such that our process can be executed on the blockchain. For the high-level idea, it's a little bit like this. You see on the left-hand side, there is this specification, and a classical way of implementing that process would be that the different parties would actually pass messages in order to inform them that they want to order something, that they confirm that an order has been received, etc. And now the idea is, instead of sending messages around, we can simply record on the blockchain that a certain state has been reached, and therefore we need to introduce some indirections here that, for instance, the bulk buyer is actually triggering a certain change of a state which is recorded on the blockchain, that then respective smart contracts that support the process can observe that this has happened and trigger the next step of the process. So this is roughly the idea, and the generic concept which can use to support any process and put it onto the blockchain. So let's try to be a little bit more specific. What are the things that we typically want to capture in a process? So when we describe the state of a process, we typically use such token semantics. For anybody who has ever seen patronets, this is exactly what is behind here. And this can be used to record where a particular order in this case is standing. And the diagram actually specifies that here when this order is received, we check stock availability. And that means once we have done this, the state changes and the process proceeds with performing this next check here. And depending on whether the items are in stock or not, we go upwards or downwards. And this is a simple decision logic that we need very often in business processes. So this is a very essential thing that we actually need to specify. So we see this can be then used to process all kinds of orders. And, whoops, this went a little bit too fast. And this can be used to specify that different orders are processed through the specification. Yeah? So that means we have on the one hand side this BPMN model as a template, and from this template we need to generate instances that support the execution of individual orders. So and the challenging thing about this is that indeed processes are not always only sequential, but we need to capture these decision logics and we need to potentially cater for concurrency. So in BPMN, there are these specific elements that handle this logic. First type is this XOR gateway. These are the gateways that handle decisions. If you see in the middle, if a token arrives, it may go up or down depending on the conditions, if here this condition would be true or not, and therefore you may actually have different branches how you continue. Corresponding element is the join that is being shown at the bottom that simply passes on the token. So that means when we want to translate the process, we need to think about how do we represent this here with blockchain artifacts. Second important element is the so-called parallel gateway. That's this AND element. Here the logic works a little bit differently, that we trigger concurrent branches of execution. If you look in the middle, when there's such a split, there are actually two different continuous branches being triggered, and there's a corresponding join. That requires that both of these incoming branches are completed, and if that is the case, it synchronizes and passes on control to the next activity. So, and in the end, this is the general idea that you can use for translating any BPMN specification onto blockchain artifacts. You need to think about how these different components of the BPMN model are being translated to respective smart contract logic. And depending on which elements you have, you put this into a template Solidity contract, and this is something that can be done automatically and spits out the respective implementational side. So when we actually did this work in 2016, this is also something that is maybe at hindsight a little bit funny. So Ingo in Sydney was driving the experiments and the evaluations that we did with this example process here, and this is from our research paper where, this is good for everybody who ever bought cryptocurrencies. So the Ether price actually was much cheaper than today. Anybody bought cryptocurrency early in the audience? Nobody there? Well, a few people there saying, yeah, that's good. So you can relate to this. But this is, of course, something also that is challenging from a business scenario perspective. If you would put a process onto such a public blockchain, and you have the volatility in the respective gas, this is something that may actually be a challenge for some business scenarios. All right, so that's a general idea that we followed on in our work. I mentioned Ingo already. That's my colleague in Sydney who's working on this with CSIRO. He has continued refining this in order to make the execution cheaper on the blockchain. And Marlon here on the right-hand side is my colleague from uni in Tartu. And they have continued with this work and implemented a full business process management system that fully operates on the blockchain. So it's not yet ready to be used as a product, but the respective project is on the net. The respective keyword is Caterpillar, and this Caterpillar system is a business process management system. You specify your processes like BPMN as you've seen that, and then it generates the respective blockchain artifacts and runs the process on the blockchain.
5 minutes.
Thanks a lot. Good. So that means that gives some more clarity into why the answer to this first question is yes, we can put any process on the blockchain. And now we have seen a bit how this works on a conceptual level. But in the end, you may wonder, is this actually a good question? And I think this is maybe a much more important question of how we can take this technology further, where we should consider it, and maybe where it is less interesting. So, two answers to this. We sat together with our research colleagues and compiled a bigger commentary paper where we try to spot like different challenges that we see when supporting processes with blockchain technology. A lot of these challenges that we see are engineering-related questions to provide better tooling and to make simply like the engineering part easier and more reliable. But there are also some questions which are kind of broader. And I think it's important to be aware of these broader challenges, even also when you're a technical person. So on the first point, you see that there is mentioned strategy and governance. And strategy and governance in that context refers to strategy and governance from a business perspective. So it means companies who are currently running their processes internally inside their company and who may consider to put processes on the blockchain, processes that they have been fully in control of, that this may be actually a challenge to actually approach this and organize this with a much broader reach because these companies are partially losing control over what is happening in these processes. And that implies all kinds of strategic and governance questions, and some companies may be risk-averse and not daring to do this at this stage. And besides from the engineering question, there's also related to this strategy and governance question, a cultural question, and that is a cultural question that relates to the business culture of the companies that may be driving projects. Also, the fact that the process is running on an open infrastructure is something that many companies would not feel very comfortable with. And that actually narrows it down already much further, which could be scenarios where companies actually feel happy and safe with putting certain processes on the blockchain. And I think one of the examples that is making that a little bit more transparent, which could be a valuable direction to think about this, is indeed this R3 achievement, which we have seen yesterday in the news. Because here something very specific happened. So it was not the HSBC Bank or it was not the ING Bank alone asking themselves, what can I do with my processes? But it was a consortium that was put together with different banks, and they started thinking about how can they organize those processes where they partner with companies, with authorities, or with other suppliers in their value chains, and how can they collaborate with them together more efficiently in an organized setting. And that's a key characteristic of some of these scenarios that are currently being put up in the banking sector, that it is not a single company looking inside into their companies, but that these companies are reaching out to partners in order to develop scenarios which suffered tremendously from media breaks and integration in the past, and blockchain technology may actually be a contributor for organizing this in a more efficient way. So, and with this, I want to close and give you like these takeaways that you read here. So first is, yes, we can. So we can put any process on the blockchain because we can represent states in the blockchain file that records transactions, and we can use smart contract logic to organize and implement the changes between different states. So, and that actually emphasizes that this is maybe not a very interesting question to ask. Can we do it, yes or no? The answer is yes, and that actually points to the question that we need to ask ourselves, which are scenarios where this technology is powerful and can do things that other technologies were not able to do in the past. And clearly we have to look into the direction of inter-organizational processes and partner with people that we frequently interact with. And that will be the direction where this technology is very promising. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Thank you. So, am I on? Yeah. Hey, thank you very much. We have a couple of minutes for questions. The next speaker, I suggest you come and get plugged in while we're doing this. There are a lot of questions here. Do you have time to talk with people as well afterwards?
I'm still here, so please approach me. Yeah. I will put myself in front of the door here.
Will your slides be available for us?
Yes, I will share them. Yes.
You will share them and you will announce that on Twitter.
I will.
At Jan Mendling. If more than half of the network is corrupted, the change just question, then is it possible to forge false transactions?
I think this is one of the things that is currently investigated, and we have seen that some blockchain networks have actually suffered from that problem, yes.
If I'm using personally identifiable data in my business processes, which as of 10 days from now I have to be able to delete, how do I delete that out of a blockchain without breaking the blockchain and making it unusable?
Very good question. So I believe this is something for the judges to decide, because it will come down to the question, if there's data that is encrypted that we cannot read anymore, if not knowing the key anymore is sufficient to satisfy that requirement.
Right, which is in many of the software organizations that I'm involved with is considered an acceptable best practice going into the unknown regulatory landscape, right? Or the judicial landscape, I guess.
Right.
All right, I think I've got time for one more here. Why would anyone want to move business processes to a public blockchain? What's the main force driving that?
So, pointing to the banking sector is very much interested in reducing transaction costs. And also this scenario, if you read a bit up on it, it makes several things in that specific scenario faster and cheaper, and this is why the banks are after this.
Fantastic. Hey, thank you so much, Jan.
Cheers. Pleasure.